So I'm headed back to Anna and Shoshana, of course, but to let them off the hook, not just to them, also to Burl, who's also here today, and her sister Janet. Oh, sorry, where did Janet go? We skipped past you. Thank you, okay. And Janet, and to Addison, pictured here with her mom and dad, Jason and Jen, and to, oops, we went too fast again. You know what, I think maybe I'll just say next. Okay, so that, okay, there we go, Katie, this is Katie. Next, to a young woman named Molly, pictured here many years ago with her brothers, Jack and Sam. And to this little girl, Isabel. And to so many more children of Chinese descent who have been adopted into American families. Because that is what the 100 Good Wishes quilt tradition is all about, making a quilt to welcome a Chinese adoptee into her new family. And just to note, these are all girls whose parents I've interviewed for research I've been doing on these quilts for the past several years. Additionally, I also want to note that the research I've done has been solely with the parents of the adoptees. So to date, I only have their side of the 100 Good Wishes quilt story. Someday, I hope to also interview adoptees about their quilts, because I think we need to have both sides. For a little bit of background, I'd like to give you an overview of the history of U.S. adoption from China. Since 1994, the single largest source for intercountry adoption in the United States has been the People's Republic of China. Between 1992, when China first officially allowed international adoptions, and 2005, when these adoptions peaked, the number grew from 210 to nearly 8,000. Although the number has declined dramatically since then, it still represents a large percentage of overall American intercountry adoptions. In 2012, for instance, 2,696 children were adopted from China, equaling 31% of all U.S. intercountry adoptions. Between 1999 and 2013, over 70,000 children of ethnic Chinese descent joined thousands of American families. This precipitous influx of Chinese children significantly altered the overall character of U.S. intercountry adoption. Indeed, the year 2005 saw the greatest number of intercountry adoptions in American history, nearly 23,000, and over a third of them were from China. These adoption numbers created what some demographers call a unique diaspora. Until recently, virtually all adoptees were girls. Thus, a gender-specific ethnic group living outside the borders of its national homeland, to use the language of demographers, was definitely novel. But beyond the numbers, the dramatic changes in the China adoption landscape also signaled momentous change for individual American families. Simply put, more parents could adopt. Many of these parents, as they embarked on the adoption journey, wanted to do something to commemorate and welcome their new child. And at some point in the late 1990s, someone discovered the Northern Chinese tradition of the Baijiabei, or 100 Families quilt, and used it as an inspiration for a new adoption-specific tradition. This new practice involved soliciting fabrics from family and friends in order to create a quilt, now being called a 100 Good Wishes quilt. The Good Wishes part referring to the added element of also submitting a written wish with your donated fabric. This addition instilled a distinctly American aspect to the practice, particularly since it coincided with what I will call the rise of the scrapbook. I don't know if any of you are scrapbookers, but something I learned in my research is that in 2010, the Craft and Hobby Association estimated that 18.4 million American households participated in scrapbooking, making it a $1.4 billion industry. Not too shabby. But quilt making, I must say, while it represents fewer households, there we go. Go back one, I think. And then forward one. Oh. I guess slide. In any case, quilt making, while it represents fewer households, only 16.8 million, it represents a much bigger spending. The quilting industry in 2010, again, stood roughly at $3.58 billion. So, way to go, quilters. Just who hit upon the original Chinese patchwork tradition and how they discovered it, I cannot say for sure, though I have the idea that Pearl S. Buck, and her book is pictured over there, might have helped the whole process along. Buck was a mid-20th century American author who based many of her novels on her experience as the daughter of missionaries in early 20th century China. You probably know her for her novel, The Good Earth. Her 1956 book, Imperial Woman, tells the tale of an imperial concubine taking steps to protect her newborn, the only son of the emperor, through the creation of a baijai. Buck writes, "She must offer the child as an adopted son by symbol to other powerful families in her clan. From the head of each of the highest 100 families in the empire, she required a bolt of the finest silk. From the silks, she commanded the palace tailors to cut 100 small pieces, and from these make a robe for her child. Thus, he belonged by symbol to 100 strong and noble families, and under their shelter, the gods would fear to harm him." So this, the passage goes on to say, "For it is well known that gods are jealous of beautiful male children born of human women, and they send down disease and accident to destroy such infants before they grow into godlike men." This is quite foreboding. But it also hits a lot of the high points we've been talking about so far: protection, community, and patchwork. In any case, adoptive families began making 100 Good Wishes quilts and sharing them with each other. This grassroots phenomenon eventually trickled up into traditional media formats like published books and television shows. And you can't read it very well here, it's washed out. But on the right, the television show wiki here is for the PBS Kids show, Arthur. There was a whole storyline about an adopted girl coming to join one of Arthur's friends' family. It's possible that some people learned about the practice this way, but quite appropriately, as this conference is subtitled, Sharing Quilt Stories in the Digital Age, the 100 Good Wishes quilt is, at its core, an internet phenomenon. Indeed, that's how I first discovered the quilt. My own background in Chinese studies and my current profession as a museum curator came together a few years ago as I began researching online what kinds of patchwork and quilted objects we might want to acquire from China for our collection. As I sifted through websites devoted to Chinese folk and textile arts, I also hit upon site after site devoted to another type of object, a Chinese-inspired quilt made specifically for adoptees. I was intrigued and very quickly hooked. Created by parents who are in the midst of adopting a child from China, the 100 Good Wishes quilt websites present a mostly consistent format. A brief summary of the family's adoption and experience to date, an introduction to the idea of the quilt and its Chinese roots, and most importantly, a call to action. They exist primarily to solicit fabric donations from friends and family for the creation of a quilt celebrating the child's adoption. As the donations arrive, parents often catalog the fabrics on the site, on the site with a photo and a description and thank each donor. Sometimes they post an image of the completed quilt to round out the experience. Here's an example of a typical site, Mia's 100 Good Wishes quilt. On the left, Mia's mother outlines the project, including a reference to Pearl S. Buck's Imperial Woman. And on the right, she catalogs the 117th and final fabric for her 100 Good Wishes quilt. This cataloging, which I said is often an integral component for the 100 Good Wishes quilt sites, reminds me very much of the stereotype of quilt makers as stash builders, acquiring, organizing, and refining their all-important fabric collection. And as a museum professional, it also makes me think of the hours I've spent cataloging and documenting objects for our collections database. So it's no wonder these sites caught my eye. As far as I can tell, it was around the year 2000 that these websites began appearing. This is the earliest site I could find, In fact, it is now defunct. You can no longer get to it, but luckily I took screenshots of it when I first discovered it. It was sites like these that I think lit the fuse for the 100 Good Wishes quilt phenomenon, and the timing was just right. If we can all momentarily enter our internal Wayback Machines and think of the internet 15 years ago, we'll remember that social media didn't exist yet, at least not in the form in which we currently recognize it. And websites were still pretty clunky things that most people didn't create simply on a whim. But things were changing. At the most fundamental level, 21st century web culture is defined by explosive growth in the number of users. In North America, there were roughly 108 million internet users in 2000. 11 years later, that number more than doubled to about 274 million, or about 79% of the total population. With massively larger numbers of people online, internet platforms became primary means of communication. The adoption industry and other adoption-related groups embraced web communication, transforming adoption in the process. Before the World Wide Web, most parents' contact from start to finish was solely with their adoption agency. Today, parents have a range of sites to choose from to access for information or help, from online discussion boards to individual web pages. Here, for instance, is the website for just one of the many agencies with a China program, Great Wall China Adoption. One of the most popular online message boards, Adoptive Parents China, hosted by yahoo.com, has nearly 18,000 members and saw multiple thousands of messages every month from when it began in 1999 until the end of 2006, when China adoption slowed dramatically. Topics of discussion on the board range from filling out paperwork to preparing to go to China to pick up your child to post-adoption transition issues. Another popular website, ChinaAdoptTalk.com, fills the gap for parents anxious to know how long the Chinese government will take to process their paperwork. Because official statistics for adoption processing times are unavailable, the owners of the China Adopt Talk site, they compile actual wait time data submitted by individual families, so you can track how long it's taking for the Chinese government to process paperwork. One major mode of internet communication, which was especially prominent, and still is, but especially prior to the mid-2000s rise of social networking sites such as Facebook, is weblogs, or blogs for short. Blogs, as I'm sure we are all aware, are websites where the owner can regularly post written and image-based entries, which are listed in reverse chronological order. And here are a couple of blogs that you really should know about. The Quilt Alliance blog on the left, and Pieced in China, on which we at my museum have documented some of the research our museum is doing on Chinese patchwork and quilts. Many blogs follow a topical or current events format and take advantage of the comments section of the site to incorporate discussion with readers, so there's interaction going on. Blogging began in the mid-1990s and in fewer than 10 years became a mainstream activity, with around 1.3 million blogs in total, nearly 70% of which were being actively maintained. By the mid-2000s, easy-to-use web publishing tools eliminated the need for specialized knowledge to create one, so you didn't have to know HTML or hypertext markup language to make one. So this opened the activity up to virtually anyone on the internet. By 2011, there were an estimated 181 million blogs, many of them hosted by popular services such as Blogger, Tumblr, and WordPress. It was in this virtual environment that the 100 Good Wishes quilt phenomenon was born and thrived. The majority of the hundreds of 100 Good Wishes quilt sites that I visited have been hosted by one of the many blogging platforms available on the web. But perhaps most important in disseminating the idea of the 100 Good Wishes quilt was an online discussion board founded in 2002, I hope that's the right year, by an adoptive mother who perceived a need for an online space where parents could exchange fabrics in order to assemble enough to make a 100 Good Wishes quilt. The 100 Good Wishes quilt, or the 100 Good Wishes Yahoo group, is set up like many other online discussion boards with its primary function being to serve as a centralized location for members' communications. The site also includes a place for posting photos and another for posting electronic files, usually documents with useful information about how to set up a fabric exchange, general quilt making tips, and Chinese cultural information, etc. Christine Brame, the Yahoo Group founder, who is with us here today, learned about 100 Good Wishes quilts through other adoption-related discussion boards and websites, and felt that a centralized location would more readily facilitate the exchanges that were already happening elsewhere. Up to that point, she said, it was a clumsy system wherein parents would email each other individually in order to exchange fabrics. She wanted to create a space in which many people could swap all at once. So a community of people dedicated to this activity. The Yahoo.com discussion board system was the best way to do it, she felt, especially since so many other adoption-specific groups already existed on the Yahoo platform. Swapping fabrics online, Christine explained, was a mutually beneficial activity. She said, a lot of people were frustrated because they would try to explain it to families and friends, and they wouldn't quite get it, or they weren't quite engaged enough to want to go get squares and share them. Whereas in our group, we were all doing the same thing. So it was fun to buy one big piece of fabric, cut it up into pieces, send it to a bunch of people, and then get squares in return. It wasn't like you were asking somebody to do something just for you. You were actually sharing. You got some, they got some, everybody was happy. It was a mutual win-win thing. After the discussion board debuted in 2002, it immediately began filling a need. It averaged over 250 posts per month in its first several years. Parents came to the site to exchange fabrics, but also to share their adoption experience with others in the same situation as themselves. It primarily served to facilitate fabric exchanges, but also became a social network in its own right. One of my research participants, Denise, described being on the Yahoo group this way. You would talk to other people about your adoption, as well as how you planned on making your quilt. We would exchange fabric, as well as exchange our adoption stories and where we were in the journey, and be excited when somebody's baby got to come home. One particularly poignant story of virtual support on the Yahoo group involves Denise, who I just quoted, and Michelle Levin and her family, who are here with us today. Michelle told me the story this way. I told the 100 Good Wishes quilt group that we could no longer adopt this little girl due to her heart condition, but we were going to try to get her help, and we were still going to go to China to adopt another baby girl. Meanwhile, one of the other members of the group, Denise, had been working on heart quilt patterns because, unbeknownst to me, she was adopting a little girl who had a heart condition also. She didn't say anything about that. She just suggested in the 100 Good Wishes group that the group make a heart quilt for the little girl that I lost and send it to China for her. That was one of the sweet, pure things that helped me. Excuse me, I'm getting a little emotional. That helped me because we were completely brokenhearted. And before we get too weepy, here's the spoiler. The Levins were able to adopt both these girls, so happy ending. These are the kinds of connections that were forged in an online community devoted to a single type of quilt. Something about quilts brings people together. And bringing people together is only one of the many reasons why, to borrow quilt expert Shelley Ziegert's phrase, why these quilts matter. So why should we care about this narrow segment of quilts that, in the larger scheme, represents just a drop in the quilt bucket, so to speak? Well, for the same reason that we care about all quilts, for the stories they tell, both on a personal and a societal or cultural level. One story that they tell is about making, what it means to make a quilt. In my interviews with 100 Good Wishes quilt makers, I discovered that every family approached their quilt project in slightly different ways, but that several similarities stood out between the informants' experiences. First of all, true to the quilt's nature as an internet phenomenon, nearly all informants discovered the 100 Good Wishes quilts online. And here I just took a screenshot of about.com, which is, I'm sure we've all been on the about.com. It's sort of like a clearinghouse of web information. This is their entry about 100 Good Wishes quilts, or by Jabe. As Shannon described it, The China adoption crowd is online, or excuse me, the China adoption crowd online is huge and very chatty. That's how I learned about the quilt originally. Huge and chatty. I'm seeing some parallels to the quilting community, I think. Anybody else? The makers, and this is Shannon's partially completed quilt, pictured there. The makers also used multiple methods to gather the fabrics, including the Yahoo group, blog posts, and soliciting directly from family and friends. Some informants came up with creative ways to encourage participation. Kelly, for instance, created a blog in which she logged the number of miles she walked each week wearing a pedometer, and she wrote about each segment as if it represented a leg in the roughly 8,000-mile journey to get to China. Finally, realizing she would not be able to virtually walk all the way there, she conceptualized the trip as a magic carpet ride, facilitated by the 100 Good Wishes quilt fabric donations. Each week she would post a picture of a donated fabric and wish, like this one, which would be the next square in creating the imaginary magic carpet that would carry them back home after going to China to meet their daughter. Interestingly, many research participants described how the 100 Good Wishes quilt project timeline often echoed that of the larger adoption process. When the adoption slowed, or even ground to a halt, which sadly has often been the case in the last 5 to 10 years, so did the quilt project. Shannon, whose adoption was supposed to take 12 to 18 months, but ended up taking 6 years, said, "I started out fast with the quilt exchange fabrics. Then, when it became clear that our wait was going to be extraordinarily long and we weren't sure whether it would even happen, I had to put it away." She talked about the acute pain she would feel every time she looked at the fabrics. She simply couldn't have them around until that moment when she found out that the adoption actually was going to take place, and then she quickly picked the project back up again. Finally, nearly every informant's 100 Good Wishes quilt project involved multiple creators. Those who acquired the fabrics, pieced them into a quilt top, and/or quilted it into a complete bed covering were frequently different people. In most cases, the level of prior experience with sewing or quilting influenced informants' decisions about whether or not they would construct the 100 Good Wishes quilt themselves. Some, like Maggie, had no background in sewing and knew from the outset that they would need someone else to construct the quilt. Maggie confessed, "I'm probably one of the least crafty people out there. I do some things, but I'm not scrapbooky. I don't quilt. I mean, this is out of my league. But it was okay. That's what's neat about this. That was the thing when I first heard about 100 Good Wishes quilts. My first thought is, I can't do that. My second thought is, why? I think I was catching on that you didn't need to do the quilting yourself. And then I realized, I live in Lancaster County. Every time I read that quotation, I can almost hear her ending that last sentence with, duh." Although she ended up having a family member make the quilt for her, Maggie knew that living in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania probably meant she could find an experienced quilt maker to help her out. You know, I've spoken to other audiences who weren't necessarily quilt makers, and I didn't get quite that same reaction. It's nice to have sort of the people who are in the know. Other people had enough sewing skills to piece the top themselves, but needed someone else to do the quilting. And a few others talked at length about how making a 100 Good Wishes quilt actually triggered a desire to become a quote-unquote real quilter. Michelle Kay, who had never made a quilt before, said, "I'm now totally addicted. It's a good thing that we are done adopting because there would be a bit of a struggle about what to do with a new child's bedroom. I'd have to give up my studio, and I wouldn't be real happy about that." And she actually has started an online business. She makes quilts for other people. She designs patterns. And another important thing she does is she finishes 100 Good Wishes quilts for parents who have done the collecting but never got around to actually making the quilt, which is pretty common. I think there are a lot of boxes full of blocks and fabrics stuffed under beds and in closets somewhere. I guess that's true for all of us, but what she does is she helps people out by completing the quilts. So the idea of who the maker is a complicated question. In some cases, it was a parent who completed the entire project by herself. In most others, however, it was a combination of people, and even the interviewees who were not the ones to physically perform the sewing rightly felt that they had been intimately involved in its making, that they were one of the makers. Another story that emerged from talking with 100 Good Wishes quilt makers focused on the idea of imagining and thinking about quilts, and imagining and thinking about China. Interviewees revealed their preconceived notions about quilts, many of which focused on ideas of history, family, intimacy, tactility, and utility. For instance, makers often talked about the donated fabrics that they most valued or responded to as being ones that had had a previous life. In other words, taken from old clothes or from another project's scraps, etc. There was a strong sense that fabric with a history, fabric that had already been touched and used, was more emotionally resonant. And I love this aspect in that it makes me think of the current t-shirt quilt phenomenon. Let's admit it. On their own, those t-shirt fabrics are pretty chintzy, maybe even ugly, but because of the history they represent, those quilts are just as cherished by their owners as any quilt out there. In addition, parents talked about quilts as metaphors for how they felt about adoption generally and about their daughters specifically. Paul said, "I really liked the idea of a child coming home to have this blanket that literally she could be surrounded with. Then also metaphorically surrounded by all those people who love her and contributed to the quilt." The quilt embodied the love and support he wanted to wrap his daughter in. I think this is something we can all relate to, particularly when we think about quilts we've made for others. Parents also spoke about their ideas of China and Chinese culture. Immediately upon deciding to adopt, most parents began augmenting their existing knowledge of China by reading as much as they could about the country, largely motivated by wanting to eventually help their child retain a connection to their birth culture. While parents talked about their children participating in cultural activities ranging from cooking Chinese food at home to attending Chinese culture camps run by organizations like Families with Children from China, which has chapters all over the country, many also saw the 100 Good Wishes quilt as a way to maintain that link. Laureen talked about how important it was to her that the 100 Good Wishes quilt have a Chinese background. She said, "I honestly don't think I would have done it if it didn't have the Chinese connection. That's what really pulled at me. I visualize a small, tiny village in northern China that was poor, and yet they were willing to all just give a little bit. It just had such an impact on me emotionally. I wanted something that I could share with my daughter, the story behind it, not only the individual pieces, but the background of why I chose to make this quilt." Amy, who adopted an older child, was concerned about her daughter being able to strike a balance between Chinese cultural retention and assimilation into American society. She felt that one way she could help keep China present in their family was to make a 100 Good Wishes quilt. She said, "I was really wanting to retain as much of my daughter's culture as I could. I want her to grow up with some constant reminders. I don't want her to feel whitewashed or anything. I want her to remember her Chinese heritage and be proud of it, while also adapting well here in the United States." The 100 Good Wishes quilt seemed like a really fun way to do that. And here is her son and her daughter on Amy's blog. Finally, as I've already talked about, the strongest story to come out of my discussions with 100 Good Wishes quilt makers is that of connecting. The quilt was seen by makers as key in their attempts to forge connections with their adopted child, often before she even came home, with online support groups, and with family and friends. The nature of inter-country adoption, with its intense periods of paperwork followed by potentially prolonged waiting, caused anxiety for many families. Working on a 100 Good Wishes quilt helped parents cope with the stress and feel like they were working towards something, working towards someone, their longed-for child. It also provided entree to online communities that gave critical aid and encouragement during the wait. Perhaps most importantly, the 100 Good Wishes quilt symbolized the support of dozens of friends and family members. Each square of fabric was tangible evidence that a community surrounded and buttressed the family during the wait and welcomed and celebrated the child upon her arrival. All of these forms of connection add up to the kind of activity that communications scholar David Gauntlet cites as critical for individual, family, and societal well-being. He writes, "Happiness cannot be determined by a certain level of material comfort. Instead, it stems from having meaningful connections with others and meaningful things to do. These projects are especially valuable if they are not contained at the individual level, but involve some form of sharing, cooperation, or contribution to other people's well-being." I hope I've succeeded in describing how 100 Good Wishes Quilts have done just that for individual children, their families, and the communities that surround and support them. I've thoroughly enjoyed sharing with you this quilt story, which, though it spans generations and continents, is a quintessential product of the digital age. Thank you. And here is my information if any of you want to email me. If you later you go home and you meet someone who's made one of these quilts, please get in touch with me. I think that would be wonderful.